Welcome to episode 38 of the G2 on 5G. It's the latest inside scoop on everything 5G. We cover 6 topics in about 15 minutes, and it's brought to you by More Insights and Strategy. I'm Will Townsend, and joining me again this week is Anshel Sag. Let's get started with my first topic. And I want to talk about earnings. So on Thursday of this week, Nokia and T-Mobile reported earnings. T-Mobile blew it out. They reported their best year ever, nearly $70 billion in revenue for the year and 5.5 million net subscriber adds. They also reported that they had the lowest churn in the industry as well. So the Magenta is firing on all cylinders. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's the first year that T-Mobile was a combined entity with Sprint. And I think realistically, we only saw about half of a year of that combined entity. And even so, I don't think we've even remotely come to realize the efficiencies of scale that combining Sprint and T-Mobile would enable. So I actually believe that long term, that their T-Mobile's profitability will actually increase, especially over the course of this year. And as they start to roll out 2.5, I think they'll be able to actually support more customers and improve the network experience as they add more customers. So I think it's going to be very interesting for this year. I think this is probably going to be their best year. Last year, there was COVID and a lot of other factors. And I just think that 2021 is probably going to be the best year they've ever had. And it's going to blow out even a blowout year that they had last year.
Yeah, no, I'm not surprised, but I'm also intrigued that they didn't really report any softness related to COVID. Certainly Verizon saw that manifest, and AT&T to a lesser extent. So their value prop remains strong. Their focus on 5G, I think you and I have talked about this before. It is definitely the most balanced. We will see Verizon and AT&T catch up with those mid-band spectrum assets that they acquired through C-band, but that will take some time. But let's shift to Nokia. They've had their challenges, they've had their ups and downs. They have a new CEO now. They reported, as well as T-Mobile, 4Q and full year. I was impressed. Their margins were quite healthy, so they rebounded somewhat. They stated that's bolstered by 5G. No surprise there. Cash flow looked really good from my perspective when I looked at their financials. And enterprise continues to be a strong area of growth for them. They saw double-digit growth. That's the group that is focused on private networking deployments. They now claim that the number of customers that are deploying multiple private networks with Nokia gear is over 260. So, from the traditional infrastructure perspective, they're certainly leaders. So I saw a lot of positive things in the earnings. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of positivity about Nokia. I think it was kind of funny that this whole short selling, Wall Street bets stock situation happened just in the days running up to Nokia's earnings.
Which affected them somewhat, right?
Which did affect them, yeah, because their stock was up to, it hit as high as 655, and now it's down to 430, but that's still higher than it was when we started the month. So net, the stock is doing better, but I'm sure it wasn't great for their investor relations and their CFO having to deal with crazy swings in the stock right before earnings. Yeah. But I think fundamentally Nokia is still a very good value buy as a stock because I think they have a very unique position in the market, and they seem to be trying hard to rebuild the company's reputation and take advantage of 5G, and they seem to be doing that to a degree. But I just think that the constant change of management at the company is not helping.
Yeah, no, it's been somewhat of a revolving door. I think that typically happens. It's like when a coach takes over a football team, and they get an all new staff. That with Pekka, coming in, that was bound to happen. But I think now that he's in place and they've done some things to re-level the organization to provide more accountability, through the business units. I think they'll reap the rewards of that over time. So we'll definitely keep our eyes on that, and we'll report back as things develop. But let's move to your first topic this week. And The CTIA produced an economic report on 5G's impact in the US, and you wanted to share some insights there.
Yeah, so I actually had an opportunity to speak with CTIA as well as Boston Consulting Group, who actually did the economic report.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really interesting because they looked at, all these different industries and not just, how does it affect the urban areas, but more importantly, how does it affect agriculture? And they went very granular. I actually, kind of peppered them a bit with some hard questions. As an analyst, I understand how this data needs to be collected and analyzed.
Yeah.
So they were really good with answering my questions, and I was very impressed with the fact that, this data is granular. Like, they are going down to the zip code and looking at how it's affecting individual zip codes and what industries are in those zip codes and what are the impacts to those industries by 5G. So
Mm-hmm.
their findings were that 5G's impact in the US will be between 1.4 and 1.7 trillion dollars over the next 10 years, which is
Mm-hmm.
massive, and that it will add an additional 3.8 to 4.6 million jobs over that 10-year period. So obviously the CTIA paid for this, and the CTIA is the industry lobbying group for the carriers in the US. So obviously this is something that benefits the operators and the industry as a whole. But in the reality, I think it's very reasonable. And I think the depth and detail they went into with the correct assumptions. This is a report that I can kind of vouch for based on my experience with talking to them and seeing the report. It's very detailed. It's extremely insightful. And I'll include a link in our description so you guys can take a look at it and read it for yourselves if you're interested.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you could do that. So, and this validates, sort of all of the, the excitement around, the U.S. being first, to 5G and the whole race with China, right? I mean, the economic impact is tremendous to GDP when you look at just the numbers that you shared there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's 5G. There's no secret that within the enterprise are going to drive a whole host of new use cases. It's going to allow for high degrees of factory automation in OT environments that have traditionally been underserved and unconnected by Wi-Fi. So
what I was going to say is I actually think this report errs on the side of conservatism in the sense that they didn't really just assume that there was some killer app that just blows up 5G and makes things, incredibly, like, this basically takes assumptions that on industries we already understand and know and exist today. Yeah. So I have a feeling that it's actually going to be on the low end. And that's why there's a 1.4 to 1.7 trillion number. But I think it's very likely it could be way higher than that if there is some kind of killer use case and killer app that gets, utilized that just doesn't even exist yet today. So I think it was very responsible of them, and I think it's a good report.
Yeah, and I think that killer app, it's lingering out there. We don't know it yet. I mean, we know the basic. We both talked about what we think are some of the top 5G use cases, but no one saw. And I hate to use the ride-sharing analogy, but in an LTE world, no one saw what ride-sharing would do to disrupt an entire industry, right? And
food delivery, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, it'll be exciting to see, like once developers get there, and they're already getting their hands, on this technology. All the major carriers in the U.S. and around the world too have proof of concept centers where they invite in developers, to play on. It was pre 5G in our test beds, and now it's it's real, live networks, to develop these next generation applications and use cases. So it'll definitely be exciting. But let's move to my second topic this week, and I want to talk about John Deere. I've talked about AgTech in the past and how I believe LTE is beginning to sort of supercharge, agriculture technology and, the ability to improve food yields and that sort of thing. John Deere, from my perspective, I've met with them before at prior CES events. They've been using GPS technology to automate the drivability of huge combines and tractors and that sort of thing. And so it was interesting. It wasn't the C-band auction that just ended that we've talked about before, but it was actually they bid on spectrum, mid-band spectrum assets in the CBRS PAL auction last year. They bought 5 tranches, spent over $500,000 with that, and they're beginning to deploy 5G private networks within their manufacturing facilities, and that's just to automate, process control and that sort of thing, improve yield and that sort of thing as well. But there's no doubt that they're kicking the tires on how can they go apply 5G, maybe in fixed wireless access scenarios, to be able, to drive sort of a broader ecosystem outside of their own manufacturing facility. So, I think, John Deere's been around for, I think it's 185 years. I think they could be a real leader here in driving the adoption of 5G within agriculture. So any additional thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting because, once they get the connectivity part of things down, I have a strong feeling that there will probably be an angle that they leverage connectivity as a part of DRM, because John Deere does have a reputation for having their tractors be very specific to who can work on them and what parts can be used. And it'll be interesting to see if they use that connectivity angle as a part of how it gets software updates and how it recognizes new types of crops and things like that, because these are very expensive, very intricate pieces of equipment.
Oh yeah.
And it'll be very interesting to see how they leverage connectivity in the day-to-day use of their tractors and other farming equipment.
Yeah, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Some of these
or millions,
big combines, millions, depending on how large it is and that sort of thing. And I actually, in my family, I have two parts of the family that are engaged in farming and ranching, and John Deere is quite expensive, and so I'm hoping that some of the goodness that sort of comes out of all of this trickles down and becomes more affordable. And you start thinking about IoT sensoring and that sort of thing, and that's a great segue to your second topic this week. And you did a little bit of research and you found a pretty interesting IoT startup that's focused on terrestrial and satellite. So why don't you share some of the details there?
Yeah, so Omnispace just got they just got $60 million in new funding. And what's interesting about that is the $60 million is specifically being used to help them grow out their satellite implementation that leverages a combination of satellite with terrestrial bands. So the satellite band is 2 gigahertz. They're calling S-Band, which I think may just mean satellite band. Yeah. But what's interesting is being able to combine satellite with some kind of low band, like let's say a 600, would really allow for solid coverage in places where it's just not possible to have, a regular, let's say 800, 900 and above bands. And it's just, I think there's going to be opportunities for satellite to fill in gaps where terrestrial doesn't necessarily work. It'll be interesting to see how it gets leveraged. Does it need to have a cellular anchor or not? Or if satellite's the anchor and cellular is, the other carrier, it'll be interesting to see how this developed, but it's going to probably take some time because it's, going to take time to get the satellites up and running and have enough coverage to really offer a solution. But 3GPP does have satellite as part of the standard, and Omnispace is working towards, developing that part of the standard and working towards making 5G connectivity part of satellite.
Yeah, I know, it's interesting. We've talked about low orbit, satellite in the past, and I think it's definitely going to be a part of the mix here. There's actually a pretty cool infographic that I shared on Twitter. So if you go check my feed out at Willtown Tech, I posted that on Thursday of this week. But yeah, I could serve backhaul. It just depends, right? It's going to have to get launched, and it's going to have to, you're going to have a density of those low orbit satellites, to fully realize the potential of all that. And there's certainly a lot of other companies that are vying for that space race. We've talked about them before, SpaceX and Hughes investment, I think, in OneWeb as well. But I think satellite is very interesting, and it'll be fun to keep tabs on it. And as we see things develop, come back to our audience here on the G2 at 5G and share that. So, well,
Definitely.
let's move to my third topic and your third topic. We're both going to talk about the Super Bowl. Go Chiefs. Okay, I'm on
I'm,
record as stating that I'm a
I'm
Mahomes
with you.
fan. He went to Texas Tech, where my youngest daughter goes. But I want to talk a little bit about Verizon and their plans, and you want to talk about T-Mobile. So let me start with Verizon. So it's no secret that Verizon's been very focused on its ultra wideband rollout, which is based on millimeter wave. It's also no secret that they've been heavily investing and building out edge computing capabilities to sort of supercharge that overall experience. So what they're hoping is the Super Bowl is going to highlight that. Now, this year at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers Stadium, they're only going to be at 25% capacity. So that equates to like 22,000 fans, I believe, compared to the last Super Bowl that I think they had 62,000 fans present and that generated 26 terabytes of data. So, but what's going to be interesting about the Super Bowl this year, it's going to be a focus on, not only, enhancing the overall entertainment experience, but providing a safe, experience for the fans. And so what I found interesting is that with that mobile edge compute and the combination of that ultra wideband 5G, they're going to be deploying applications that do facial recognition for ticketing, thermal scans, obviously for temperature checks, and the ability for fans while they're in their seats to check wait times for restrooms and concession stands and that sort of thing. And obviously that's going to limit, the opportunity for people to be, closer together and that sort of thing. And they'll also do some pretty innovative things, I think, with like camera views and that sort of thing that fans will be able to control on their smartphones in the stadium. But I think, those are some really stellar, solid examples of, 5G's capability with, with that ultra low latency for those video intensive and, applications, as well as, the censoring activities and those sorts of things. So, but why don't you share with us what T-Mobile's got planned?
Yeah, so I've been following the T-Mobile side of things, and it's been interesting because Neville, the company's president of technologies, former CTO, tweeted out a series of tweets about T-Mobile's deployment in the Tampa area, as well as the stadium itself. And what was really interesting is that T-Mobile is actually rolling out their millimeter wave at 39 gigahertz, as well as their mid-band at 2.5, and they've got 600 megahertz. And they didn't just cover the stadium, but in fact, they have a whole map of the Tampa, St. Petersburg, Clearwater area, and most of the highly populated areas are now covered with their 2.5 gigahertz mid-band, and then the rest is pretty much covered with 5G being 600 megahertz. I would say, based on what I'm looking at the map here, you can check out the map online. I would say about 70 to 80% of the area is being covered in 5G, and the rest is LTE. But that's pretty good. And what's interesting is he tweeted out a picture of a speed test result, which everybody does nowadays. But what's interesting is they got 1.6 gigahertz or 1.6 gigabits per second and 10 millisecond ping, which means that they're obviously using millimeter wave, but you're also much less likely to see a huge drop off in performance once you leave that range. So you may leave that 1.6 gigabits per second at the stadium, but once you leave, you could still get 500 to 600 megabits on that 2.5 band, maybe even more, because what's interesting is T-Mobile rolled out 80 megahertz of 2.5, which is an absolute colossal amount, and could, in theory, deliver upwards of 1.2 or 1.3 gigabits per second, obviously best case scenario. But realistically, I would expect 800 megs to a gig, and that's not even on millimeter wave. So it'll be really interesting to see what kind of speeds are available in Tampa outside the stadium. Unfortunately, I'm not going, so I can't even go out there and test it. But it's going to be really interesting to see, people going out and testing it, because I believe most markets are 40 and 60, so 80 is a lot.
It is, and so it sounds like T-Mobile is doing this without having to bring extra cows and goats
Yeah.
and all of the cute names they call these
It's their
portable.
it's their ultra capacity band. So they've,
Yeah,
when you've got 80 megahertz of that stuff laying around,
it's
you don't
huge. Yeah,
it doesn't really you don't really have to worry about capacity as much.
right. Yeah, this will be killer. So Verizon and T-Mobile doing it out. I'm sure AT&T will be doing some things to improve,
Yeah, I
and
haven't seen
enhance the
anything from them on the big
experience.
game, but they usually send us something ahead of the big game.
They do. Well, if we have any late breaking news before we post the the podcast, we'll insert it in there. Well, hey Anshel, another great episode this week. Why don't you take us home?
Absolutely. We hope you guys listened to our podcast and found this week's topics interesting. If anyone out there would like to provide us with insights on a specific 5G topic for a future podcast, please reach out to us on social media. Will is at Welltown Tech, and I'm at Anshel Sog. We hope you have a great weekend, and please tune in again next week.